Hi, friends. Today we're going to take a detailed look at another scene, a fairly complex one, primarily due to the scale and volume of the space. In front of us is a large villa with a double-height ceiling, which immediately sets high demands on lighting and composition. In addition, this single scene combines a kitchen, living room, corridor, hall, and staircase. The space is multi-layered, open, and complex to perceive. That's exactly why I chose this scene for analysis. With a high probability, you'll encounter similar interiors many times in your practice, and it's important to understand how to work with them and what kind of result you should be aiming for. Let's start by looking at the initial renders. Overall, this is a fairly solid lighting setup that can already be worked with. However, there are aspects that require significant refinement. The biggest concerns are related to the kitchen lighting. All possible light sources are turned on here, which makes the lighting too uniform and the image flat, lacking realistic depth. In the other zones, the situation looks better. A sense of volume begins to appear. The space reads more clearly, and contrast starts to work in favor of the scene. Still, the overall mood of the interior remains overly cold. Even the wooden surfaces feel cold in tone, which breaks the sense of coziness and material authenticity. Special attention should also be paid to the materials. There are visible foreign, dirty-looking spots on the surfaces that appear unnatural and reduce the overall image quality. The cause may lie in sky reflections or incorrect shader settings, but visually, the material looks contaminated and untidy. There are also geometry issues present. In some places, the wooden material runs directly onto the walls, creating the impression that the elements have no physical thickness. A similar problem can be seen in the marble work. The lack of clear constructive logic immediately lowers the level of realism in the scene. In the next stages, we'll go through all of these points in detail and gradually bring the scene to a balanced, deep, and professional look, where lighting, materials, and geometry work together as a single, cohesive environment. In this scene, the geometry contains several errors. They may have appeared if the model was imported from Revit, because the wall meshes weren't closed. These geometry issues had to be fixed, because otherwise they affected the materials. Still, in the end, we achieved quite good renders. Overall, the interior space is lit correctly, it reads well, and doesn't get lost in the volume. However, our main task is to shift the focus specifically onto the interior, making it the key element of the scene, while the exterior view outside the windows should remain secondary, more like a background. Lighting plays a critically important role in this scene. At first, there were many incorrect materials with stains, and I didn't fully understand what was causing them, but after adjusting the lighting settings, these problems disappeared, and the materials started to render cleanly and correctly. Now let's quickly look at the final result. This is the kitchen area. I changed the camera angles because I wanted to present the interior in a more aesthetic and flattering way. The space itself stayed the same. We're simply viewing it from a different point. By the way, there's another small but important mistake here. The appliances were mirrored, so the Bosch logo read backwards. These seemingly minor details also need attention, because they're exactly what creates a sense of professionalism. So what do we have in the end? I replaced the chair material, refined the wood material, and also worked on the lighting. As a result, I was able to light the kitchen space much better and make it feel more alive and deeper. This is the dining area. The same close-up, but from the other side, which helps the form and composition read more clearly. And here we have the living room, shot from another angle to show the inner courtyard. I also added wider horizontal shots that fully reveal the space, show the window view, and present the architecture as a whole. With this kind of presentation, the scene looks more logical, more cohesive, and much easier to perceive. And the final angle for this zone is a view toward the kitchen, which unites all areas into a single spatial composition. There are some changes and differences in this scene that I deliberately didn't introduce myself. They were already included in the updated version of the file. The only truly major intervention on my part is the ceiling. Later, I'll explain in detail why this decision was necessary. For now, let's look at the staircase area. This is how it looks in the scene. I lit it well, because this space is naturally very dark, and it's important to show that light still reaches it, even if only minimally. The plants are also worth mentioning. In the initial version, they looked too dark and basically disappeared in the space, so it was necessary to add at least one extra light source to draw attention to the fact that truly beautiful, high-quality plants are used here. Let's move step by step and break down how to go from this initial state to the final render. What exactly needs to be changed, which decisions are essential, and what lighting setup makes the most sense for this scene. We'll go through everything gradually. The first thing I always start with is organizing the scene. In this case, the situation with layers is critically bad. There are practically no layers, and almost all objects are placed on a single one. This creates serious difficulties in the workflow. For example, when setting up lighting, we often need to temporarily hide the plants because they obstruct the view of the scene and significantly slow down interactive rendering. So the first step is to structure the scene using layers. We move all the plants into a separate layer and turn it off. It also makes sense to include bushes there as well, if they're present in the scene. Next, we have the inner courtyard area. I also separate it into its own layer. We'll definitely turn it back on later, but at this stage it's important to organize the scene so that walls, zones, and cameras are clearly readable. Anything that interferes with spatial orientation is better hidden temporarily. Special attention should be paid to cameras. Fortunately, there aren't many of them here, but if your scene contains a lot of cameras, always place them on a separate layer and hide it while working. This way, they won't distract you or interfere with the setup process. So, we've covered the first steps of organization, and now we can move on. It's important for me to clearly separate the space into distinct zones. For example, the kitchen and the living room. Working in this format is much easier and more logical. The island, chairs, and kitchen units all need to be organized. Moreover, the kitchen itself was initially quite problematic because the objects were excessively fragmented into individual elements. Some were grouped, others weren't. All of this needed to be reworked. For instance, the plinth in this scene goes completely beyond correct geometry. These are the kinds of details you must pay attention to, because otherwise the scene will be uncomfortable, not only for you, but also for anyone you might pass the file to in the future. That's why you should always carefully check the layer structure. Decorative elements, for example, I immediately place into a separate layer and turn it off. The same applies to the kitchen. And once again, we see the same issue. Everything is overly fragmented, which makes working inconvenient. So I group the decor into a single section. I have a naming error here. We'll fix that now. These things should also be checked so that there's no chaos in the scene, even at the level of object names. Separately, I create a layer for the dining area. We'll also have a separate layer for the living room, which we temporarily turn off. If necessary, you can create a separate layer for the staircase. There's also an elevator area here, and since the elevator is present in the scene, it makes sense to include it in the same group. As a result, we're mostly left with the walls, which we'll continue working with. Additional wooden elements are also checked. I turn off the sun. We'll be setting up the lighting from scratch. In the end, we're left with just the wall zone, which is convenient to work with. This way, we quickly and systematically sorted the scene into layers, creating a comfortable environment for further work. As a result, only the walls remain, allowing us to work properly without visual noise. However, there are still some issues with the wall geometry, so we isolate all problematic areas as much as possible. For additional comfort in the viewport, I turn off the background and work without it. For example, here's a wall. It needs to be isolated, and right away, certain flaws become visible. In some places, smoothing needs to be applied, or the geometry needs to be edited further. It feels like the scene was imported from Revit or ArchiCAD, because extra faces and incorrect mesh topology appear in certain areas. Overall, everything looks acceptable, but these details absolutely require attention. Geometry needs to be cleaned up, and you must make sure that surfaces don't intersect with each other. For example, in the kitchen area, there's an issue with the doors. Planes intersect there, just like with the marble surfaces. For some reason, they overlap, which creates serious problems in visualization. We also checked whether the second floor incorrectly overlaps the first one. These are things that must always be adjusted. Next, there's an issue with the tiles. Currently, the tiles overlap with the grass. Either the tiles should have been raised, or the grass lowered, because right now it feels like these spaces don't connect at all. Even when the garden zone is enabled, you can see that the tiles overlap other surfaces, and that's the core of the problem. It would make much more sense to work on the interior tiled area separately. In addition, there's another unclear situation here. It looks like there is a floor, but grass is intersecting it at the same time. In other words, there are surface intersections, and that's on. Let's take a look at what settings were actually used here, and what kind of lighting this scene originally worked with. Judging by everything, sky was used at first. Or rather, no, in fact, there's an HDRI here. I honestly don't remember exactly, because at different stages I tried both sky and various HDRI maps. In the end, the scene does use an HDRI, but with very serious issues in the settings. If we look more closely, we can see that simple exposure was pushed all the way up to a value of 6. With parameters like that, it's absolutely possible to get technical glitches or incorrect light behavior. On top of that, the scene was rendering extremely slowly, simply because the exposure was artificially overcranked. Add to this the excessive contrast, which can also cause problems in rendering. At the same time, the HDRI map itself wasn't adjusted at all. It was just added to the scene without any work on exposure or balance. As a result, all the corrections were attempted through the global scene settings instead of through the HDRI itself. And that's exactly what became the core of the problem. So the first thing I do is reset all of these parameters. We're going to build the lighting from scratch. So at this stage, it's important to return to a clean baseline. I remove one lutee, temporarily turn off filmic, disable the vignette, leaving only default neutral settings that are comfortable to work with. Then we turn the kitchen and living room back on and take a look at the cameras. The cameras here are also not very clearly organized, so it's hard to understand what to orient yourself by. That means they need to be at least logically named and structured. For example, living room 1, living room 2. Here we have the dining area. There's also one general shot from the same angle. I believe that if angles are duplicated, there's no point in keeping both. They don't add any extra value. Overall, all the main cameras are already here. But I would definitely add one main camera specifically for lighting setup, a camera through which we understand how the scene looks as a whole. We switch to a horizontal format. This will be the main angle. You should always have one key interior view. Imagine you only have one chance to show the space. That's your main view. In this case, it's a horizontal shot. For interiors of this scale, there's no real point in doing a lot of close-ups. We're dealing with huge volumes here, so it makes more sense to work with very wide focal lengths in order to capture the space as fully as possible. In scenes like this, it's perfectly acceptable to use a focal length as wide as 15 millimeters, simply because we need to show the architecture as a coherent system, the interaction of space, materials, and light. I understand that such angles can look unusual or even strange, but in this case, they're absolutely justified. These are exactly the kinds of shots that allow the architecture to be read correctly. Before moving directly into creating this interior, there's a mandatory stage that applies to absolutely any scene: choosing references. Our brain needs an anchor. We need a point of reference to guide us throughout the process. Without references, you simply won't be able to objectively assess how close you are to the result you're aiming for. That's why references are not optional. They're essential. I gathered a very large number of examples, looked through different interiors, analyzed lighting, space, and even finished renders, all in order to understand how to properly light large-scale spaces like this. If we look at similar interiors, we'll see that wide-angle cameras are used extensively. We need to show as much of the space as possible: large windows, volume, depth, and a lot of greenery outside the glass. These are very wide fields of view and dynamic perspectives. Notice that in such shots, you see a lot of ceiling and a lot of floor. This is no longer just an interior. It's a full architectural space that needs to be conveyed as a whole. That's why using ultra-wide angles here is not only acceptable, but actually necessary in order to show the scene properly. Another important function of references is understanding materials through lighting. For example, I paid attention to the fact that this space has a gray floor material. We need to clearly understand what kind of reflections it produces under certain lighting conditions. The same applies to the ceiling, how light behaves on this material, and what reflections we should be seeing in our interior. It's also important to analyze how the greenery outside the windows looks in different situations, when it's close to the windows in direct sunlight, and when the lighting is overcast and diffuse. Artificial light sources deserve separate attention as well: how they work, how light falls on the staircase, and how accents are formed. All of these nuances are extremely important, and they need to be considered before you even start setting up the scene. Based on this analysis, we form a key visual reference image that we'll rely on throughout the entire process. Now I'm going to open PureRef and simply load the chosen reference there. It will sit next to the workspace, on the side, so we can keep it in our field of view at all times. I'll scale it down slightly, and these are exactly the kinds of interiors we'll be using as our visual target. When you have a clear understanding of the image you need to arrive at, it becomes much easier and more precise to set up lighting and control the overall visual result. The first thing I start with is creating an override material. And there's an important nuance here. because previously we worked a lot with minimalist interiors where there's one dominant tone, most often beige. But in this scene, the situation is different. We have large wooden surfaces, beige elements, and a gray floor. So in reality, we're dealing with three main materials that we'll be working with in parallel. Accordingly, we won't have just one override material, but several. The first one is the main beige tone, which will apply to furniture and decor. At the same time, we must exclude the wood and the floor material so that we can adjust these three key materials separately and then build the lighting correctly around them. I'll show this in practice now. First, I turn off everything unnecessary. We're setting the scene up from scratch. I'll also be rebuilding the main materials, so I temporarily remove them as well. Next, I create a Corona physical material. As a base, we can take a light beige tone. In fact, it can even be sampled directly from a reference. I was able to add some glossiness so the material doesn't look flat and has a sense of volume. After that, I add it to the override. The next step is working with the wood material present in the scene. We have veneer. This is how it currently looks. From the overall feel, the client wanted an interior in a similar stylistic direction, but if we look at the final renders, the wood tone there doesn't match what we're seeing in the scene now. It's too dark. Perhaps a reddish undertone was planned, but in the end, it doesn't quite fit into the overall picture. So at this stage, we need to choose an approximate wood tone that we want to arrive at. For now, I completely turn off the base color and focus solely on the texture map. By the way, it's not entirely clear why a reflection map is being used here. We keep the glossiness map and a slight bump, but overall, we'll be aiming for roughly this kind of color tone. All the main wooden elements in the scene, panels, cladding, beams, I temporarily turn off. The beams here are also wooden, so we disable them as well. This way, we lock in the base wood tone we'll be working with going forward. The main beige wall material can already remain active. We'll handle the floor a bit later, as a separate step. At this point, when we already have a main camera view, basic override materials, and a clear scene structure, we can move on to setting up the lighting. In this scene, we're using an HDRI map, so we start by clearing all existing settings. I'm going to switch to the Cosmos browser now. A bit of context. When I was working on this interior and testing different lighting setups, I was genuinely interested in finding the most optimal solution specifically for this space. I tried many options, various HDRI maps from Polyhaven, different maps from the Cosmos browser. I especially liked some of the moodier, more evening-like options. They created an interesting atmosphere. In the end, I settled on HDRI map number 29. I'll show you what it looks like. This is the kind of light source it has. It's daylight with a small but well-defined light source that creates beautiful light rays. At the same time, the map remains cloudy, but still has a visible sun. So it's a fairly bright and intense HDRI, and this is the one we'll be using going forward. I also tried lighting the scene using Corona Sky, and the result was quite good, almost identical in terms of overall brightness. However, the difference was that it lacked cool, bluish reflections, especially on the floor. An HDRI map gives much more realistic reflections on materials, and that's its key advantage. The light intensity may be similar, but it's the reflections that create a sense of photorealism. In addition, the scene contains artificial light sources. For now, we turn all of them off, because one of the main problems here was the excessive number of active lights. At this stage, all artificial lighting is completely disabled. Some fixtures even have to be ungrouped manually. You need to go inside and turn off each light source individually. This is an important point. On top of that, they weren't created as instances. They were simply copied, which resulted in a huge number of active lights accumulating in the scene. We remove all of that. There are lights here as well. Turn them off. Essentially, almost all light sources were active, and that created chaos. Now we've fixed it. After that, we can work exclusively with the HDRI map. We safely delete the old one, connect the new map, and I was able to pass it through Corona color correction. We reconnect everything from scratch and observe how the scene starts to behave. The first thing we need to do is choose the correct orientation of the map. We enable interactive rendering and lock the camera to this view. There's an important characteristic of interiors like this. In very complex, large-scale spaces, especially when a project is prepared for a developer, each camera angle is often lit separately. But when we're working for a designer or architect, where it's important to show many angles of the same space, creating individual lighting for each shot is simply unrealistic. That's why our task is to set up the most universal lighting possible, one that allows us to easily add new angles without losing volume in unexpected areas. I always pay close attention to this. So, first, HDRI orientation. Our main windows are located here, so we start by rotating the map roughly 90 degrees. Then we can fine-tune the sun position if needed. Here's our sun. Let's try, for example, 80 degrees. I want the light to fall onto the sofa. Good. Let's try 70 degrees so the rays penetrate deeper into the space. If necessary, I can also lower the HDRI map vertically. The lower the light source, the deeper the sun rays penetrate into the interior. For example, at values like minus zero point -0.8 or minus zero point -0.9, sunlight reaches much further inside. But for now, I'll leave it at minus zero point -0.3. What I like about the maps from the Cosmos browser is that they already have sufficient intensity. We don't need to crank up the output amount. The only thing I add is a slight desaturation. Pay attention to the reflections that appear. This is extremely important. We need exactly these bluish reflections from the sky, because they're what make the interior feel realistic. Look, there's a subtle blue tint appearing on the floor, and the surfaces reflect the cool sky. These are precisely the nuances we need. Where these reflections are missing, the image immediately starts to look like just a render. But here we have warm light and cool shadows. That balance appears. You absolutely need to notice these moments and consciously register them for yourself. Next, we'll do a bit of work with tone mapping. Right now, there's a basic, essentially empty preset applied. I'll temporarily exclude the walls from the override, so we can see all the wooden surfaces. We need to observe how strong reflections from the wood behave in the space. Our wood has a fairly saturated tone, so it can produce orange reflections. Good. Now let's return to tone mapping. The first thing I want to do is add just a bit of contrast. Next, we add a LUT. As usual, my favorite grungy one, but very carefully in this case, only about zero point .2 to zero point .3 at most. It's important for us to preserve the softness of both the interior and the light. I also want to make the interior a bit warmer in tone and add more green, since there's a lot of vegetation around, and that color should be felt in the space. After that, I add another LUT for a subtle hard contrast, around zero point .6 to zero point .7, to slightly emphasize the volume. Next, I reduce the exposure of the HDRI map because it feels too bright to me, and I slightly increase the intensity of the sun rays. For now, we'll leave it like this. I also adjust the blue tint a bit, adding a very subtle greenish shift. I want to move more toward the green spectrum because of the surrounding context. At the same time, I work on the wood material. It feels like we should add some glossiness, reduce the intensity of the texture map, and blend it in a softer ratio. As a result, we get a clearer wood pattern and nice reflections. Overall, it looks pretty good. Next, I noticed that some areas still need additional lighting. For example, the corridor zone doesn't look contrasty enough. Even though there are windows there, logically light should be reaching that area. So we start adding modeling light sources to shape a nicer light pattern and soften heavy shadows. For this, I create a corona disk and make it targeted. One disk is aimed toward the corner with the sofa, since that area is in shadow. I set a standard value, around 0.35. The second one is placed on the opposite side. I also want to draw special attention to the glass. Right now, I'll make it as clean as possible, because earlier it was dark with surface translucency. Now the light passes through the windows much better. That was exactly what was preventing enough light from entering the interior. Glass materials should always be checked first. Many people still use glass materials that barely let any light through at all. We've covered this many times in lessons, but for some reason, correct standard glass materials are still often ignored. This leads to overly intense exterior lights and overcranked exposure. For now, we'll leave it as is. In terms of lighting, at this stage everything looks good. The only thing I still want to adjust is the overall interior tone. It feels too beige to me. There aren't that many colors here, so I'll shift the balance slightly toward gray to avoid excessive warmth. At this point, the overall situation looks fine. We temporarily disable the plants, because this is an accent area. And right now, they look too dark, almost like black spots. As soon as we light them up a bit, some volume immediately appears, and the plants stop looking like a solid dark mass. This is already a much better result, although, to be honest, there's still not quite enough light here. So the next step is to carefully start introducing artificial light sources to add a bit more brightness specifically to this area. To allow light to pass inside more freely, I decided to temporarily turn off the windows so nothing refracts the light and it can enter the space more easily. Something like this. Great. Now we need to place light discs near the staircase. That's already much better. Let's now turn off the floor and see what's happening with the material. We still need to work on it. We leave it for now. There's one more thing I remember. I changed the ceiling. I made it wooden. If you look at references of similar interiors, in most of them, the ceilings are finished with the same veneer as the walls. From an architectural standpoint, this looks logical and cohesive. Even if the ceiling were dark, it would look questionable. With wood, however, it works much better. I'll do a bit more work on the material, because the tone still feels too saturated. Now it looks better. We can also remove the stairs from the override, same with the windows. And what do we see next? The window frame still looks too dark. These are exactly the kinds of nuances that must be addressed, so we go back into the material settings and start adjusting. In the glass material, I remove reflections. Then, I adjust the window metal. And now, reflections start appearing on the window frames. That's a good sign? Great. Now let's turn off elements like the chandelier and the shelving unit. A cohesive image is starting to take shape. We can also add small local light sources here. As for the rug, in interiors like this, if the rug is small, it's better to place two of them, roughly like this. In this case, the rug was too small. There wasn't even enough space to properly place it near the armchair. Two smaller rugs work much better than one that's simply undersized. I did a bit of detail work, replaced the cushions on the sofa, chose a different rug color. In principle, we could have kept the old one and just refined its material. But from a design perspective, to create a better dialogue with the wood, a warm brown rug makes more sense here. Now I'll quickly import these elements into the scene and show you how everything looks with the new materials. For now, let's turn all of this off. I delete the old rug. Next, I need to set up the HDRI for the background. Some objects are slightly floating, but we'll fix that. We just need to define the minimum and maximum values along the z-axis, and that way, all objects snap into their correct positions. We place the new rug, and look at how differently the space starts to work. I'll also replace the sofa and the armchair, since I had already worked on that material earlier. I think I took it either from our library or from a previous scene. We won't focus on that right now. Pay attention to what I did here. I rotated the armchair, changed the materials, and just from that alone, the composition became much more interesting. Now we turn off the decor. And here's the area with the artwork. Ideally, it should be lit separately. There should be either a directional spotlight or a local light source here. Next, we gradually turn off all objects and work through each material individually under this lighting setup. For example, here I'd like to slightly increase the brightness of the plants. And at the very end, I often enable bloom to get that soft glowing effect. We also temporarily turn off the windows, and I'll be able to work through all materials that are part of the exterior. The overall logic of lighting setup is that we balance the cool tones of the sky with warm sunlight and warm interior light sources. It's exactly this interaction between cool and warm that creates a realistic effect. There are a lot of windows here, so it's extremely important to show the greenery and convey green reflections on the materials. The grass also needs separate attention, because it looks too dark. As for some of the metal elements, I barely changed them. Yes, there were some material tweaks in the kitchen, but I've shown you the core working principle that really matters here. I don't want to focus on the kitchen right now, because essentially I changed almost nothing there, except for the artificial light above the island. The material adjustments were very subtle, with minimal corrections. So in this breakdown, we'll concentrate on the main spaces. Next, I want to show how the cameras look and how we work with them. We add a main camera for the view toward the window. By the way, the dining area layer is currently turned off, so I'll make those objects visible. Be sure to check that the wood isn't too glossy. It's also important to temporarily turn off the dining area with its lamps and tables and work on it separately. There's another important point here. The scene contains unclosed geometry in some areas. There are actually quite a lot of these nuances. Because of that, lighting can behave slightly differently in certain spots. For example, where door openings aren't closed, or where geometry remains open. Only after fully refining the geometry did I realize that this was exactly what caused the difference in tones between intermediate shots and the final result. In this camera angle, the first priority is properly working on the plants. We also lower the exposure specifically for this shot. We can step back a bit and treat it separately. Refine the geometry, adjust the lighting, and reduce the exposure approximately. If needed, we can also add extra light to certain areas. By the way, I also clad the front planes of the upper floor with wood. Here we use the same tone as on the walls, but we abazedal to cover them with veneer. The edges must match the second floor because this is a single architectural block. Often, elements like this are even made as a separate panel, and it's important to preserve that logic so the structure feels cohesive. I would also slightly brighten the other wooden elements. Here I close the window and refine the exterior materials. By the way, the tone here should be a bit warmer. And in the final result, that's exactly where we end up. At the end, we'll simply go through the cameras. I'm now restoring the standard dimensions. As for the other angles, here we step back again and increase the focal length. We need to show more of the background outside the window, so we move the camera so that the sofa doesn't enter the frame. We set up the angle roughly like this. This is a view of the living room. Be sure to enable vertical alignment, because it wasn't set here. I honestly don't understand why f-stop was used everywhere in the wide shots, but now we're setting everything up logically, so that the inner courtyard and the sofa composition are clearly visible. This shot can be kept, but I'd step back a bit more to show more space. The next shot follows the same logic. We move farther back and increase the focal length. I'd even slightly open up the sofa from this side. The situation here is similar. We need to cover this part with wood. And since this is a window-facing angle, we can slightly lower the exposure. As for the kitchen shots, I changed them quite significantly. Basically, I replaced them with one strong distant shot, carefully positioned the camera, and refined the kitchen materials and geometry. Next, we widen the frame a bit more and set it up roughly like this. At this stage, I already turned on the artificial light sources. I simply reused and repositioned the ones that were already present in the scene. At the same time, we once again refine the geometry. Cabinets, joints, details. Overall, I spent a lot of time specifically on fixing the geometry so that it would look correct in the video. I won't focus on this separately, but we've already covered the logic of the process together. How to set up camera angles, how to adjust lighting, how to place warm accents, and how, in the end, to create shots that present the space in a rich and appealing way. Once again, I want to draw your attention to the final result. We arrived at it through the interplay of warm and cool tones. This concludes the short breakdown. I'll show the final scene as it turned out. Here's how the geometry is organized now. The kitchen is properly assembled. All cabinets are neat. The doors have correct geometry, and everything is comfortable to work with. There's also an auxiliary box here that casts a shadow in one of the shots. This is a frontal view of the kitchen. The box is invisible to the camera, but it's necessary to create the shadow. Otherwise, the kitchen facade would be overly blown out due to the strong light coming from the window. It's a small but very useful trick. These are the main camera angles. And this is how the scene looks at this stage. That's all. Thank you. I hope this breakdown was useful for you.